The land had been quiet for years. Not the kind of quiet people talk about, but the kind that settles into the ground and stays there. When Thomas Hale first stepped out of his truck, he noticed it immediately. No birds scattering, no sudden movement in the grass, just the slow sound of wind passing through open fields that had stopped expecting company. Thomas stood there longer than he needed to. He had learned, a long time ago, not to rush moments like that. The army had trained speed into him. Retirement had taught him restraint. 68 years old, 23 years in uniform, 45 years of doing things when someone else said now. This land was the first thing in his adult life that didn't belong to an order. The farmhouse itself wasn't much, if you could even call it that. A low, weather-beaten structure with a sagging roof and a porch that leaned just enough to remind you it had survived on patience, not maintenance. The barn sat farther back, gray wood bleached by decades of sun and rain. Its doors were shut. One hinge looked newer than the others, which Thomas noted without knowing why. He didn't smile. He rarely did. But something in his chest loosened. The realtor had talked too much. About potential, about peace, about how the land had been passed over again and again. Thomas had stopped listening after the word quiet. Quiet was something you earned. He walked the perimeter slowly, boots sinking slightly into the grass. No fresh tire tracks, no footprints near the fence line. The gate creaked when he opened it, a sound that echoed farther than it should have. He liked that too. That evening, he didn't unpack much. A duffel bag, a folded blanket, a coffee tin he'd carried since his second deployment, dented and scorched but still reliable. He cooked a simple meal on a portable burner, ate standing up, then sat on the porch as the sun went down. The sky turned a clean, honest orange, the kind that reminded him of early mornings overseas, before things went wrong. He slept better than he had in years. Thomas woke before dawn as he always did. No alarm, no noise, just habit. For a moment, he didn't know where he was. That happened sometimes now. A blank second floating between decades. Then the smell of wood and old dust brought him back. He stood, stretched his shoulders, and poured himself coffee. The horizon was just beginning to lighten. Another quiet morning. That was when he heard it. Not a sound exactly. More like the absence of one. He stood still, listening. The barn. Something about it felt different. Thomas didn't grab a weapon. He hadn't owned one since leaving active service. He believed too many men relied on tools when what they needed was awareness. He walked slowly across the grass, each step deliberate. He stopped once, scanning the fence line again. Nothing. When he reached the barn, he noticed the door wasn't fully closed. It hadn't been that way the night before. He didn't touch it right away. Instead, he studied the ground. No obvious tracks, no sign of forced entry. Just flattened grass near the threshold, like someone had walked in without urgency. Thomas pushed the door open. The smell hit him first. Hay, old wood, warmth. Then he saw them. 2 women. They were sleeping on a bed of hay near the back wall, wrapped in thin blankets that did not belong to him. One lay on her side, her hair loose and dark against the straw. The other slept on her back, hands folded loosely over her chest, breathing slow and even. They didn't stir. Thomas didn't speak. He stood there longer than most men would have, long enough to notice details. Worn shoes near the wall, a thermos beside them. No bags, no obvious signs of panic or haste. They looked settled, not hiding, not afraid, as if the barn had accepted them before he had. His first instinct, trained deep and early, was to establish control, to make his presence known, to restore order. He did none of that. Instead, a question formed in his mind, heavy and unwelcome. How long have they been here? Another followed, sharper. And why weren't they afraid of being found? The women slept on. Thomas stepped back and closed the barn door quietly, the same way you close a door on something that hasn't finished speaking yet. He returned to the house, poured out his coffee without drinking it, and sat at the small wooden table, hands resting flat on the surface. The land outside was still quiet, but it no longer felt empty. Thomas Hale did not go back to the barn right away. That alone said more about him than most men would notice. He sat at the table instead, the chair pulled close, elbows resting on the wood. He had learned, over decades, that the first move after a surprise often revealed more than the surprise itself. Rash action closed doors. Stillness opened them. Outside, the sun climbed slowly. Light spread across the fields, turning the grass a sharp green. It should have been peaceful. It wasn't. His mind replayed the image over and over, not the women themselves, but the way they slept. No tension in their bodies, no sense of readiness. They hadn't laid down expecting to flee. That unsettled him more than any intruder ever had. By mid-morning, Thomas made breakfast. Eggs. Toast. He ate slowly, listening. The farmhouse creaked as it warmed. Somewhere far off, a tractor started and stopped. Life, continuing as if nothing had changed. Afterward, he put on his jacket and walked toward the barn again. This time, he did not stop at the door. One of the women was awake. She sat upright on the hay, knees drawn close, watching him as if she had been waiting. Not startled, not defensive, just alert. The second woman stirred a moment later, pushing herself up on one elbow, eyes narrowing against the light. Neither spoke. Thomas stood just inside the doorway, hands visible, posture neutral. "You can't stay here," he said at last. His voice was calm, flat, the voice of a man used to giving statements, not invitations. The younger-looking woman, early 40s maybe, tilted her head slightly. "We know," she said. Her accent was faint but noticeable. Rural. Local, but not from nearby. That answer irritated him more than resistance would have. "Then why are you here?" The older woman answered this time, late 50s, hard lines around her eyes, a face shaped by years of wind and disappointment. "Because it was empty," Thomas exhaled through his nose. "It isn't." "It was," she replied. "Last night." That was technically true, and Thomas didn't like technical truths. They had a way of slipping past rules. "You should have asked," he said. The younger woman looked down at her hands. There was no one to ask. Silence settled between them, thick and uncomfortable. Thomas noticed details again. Their clothes were clean but worn thin, not homeless, not travelers, something in between. People who had stopped belonging somewhere but hadn't yet accepted it. "How long?" he asked. The older woman met his eyes. "One night." That wasn't the answer he expected. "Before that?" She hesitated. "Not here," she said carefully. "Nearby." Nearby meant a lot of things, none of them good. Thomas stepped farther inside the barn, stopping well short of them. He looked around. No food waste, no mess. They had used the space without claiming it. "Who are you?" he asked. The younger woman spoke. "My name is Ellen. This is my sister, Ruth." They didn't offer last names. "Where are you from?" Thomas pressed. Ruth shook her head. "That doesn't matter." He didn't like that answer either. "Everything matters," he said. A faint smile touched Ellen's mouth, then disappeared. "That's what our father used to say." Something in her tone stopped Thomas from continuing. He had learned to recognize that pause, the moment when a question crossed into territory that didn't belong to him yet. He turned and stepped back into the sunlight. "You have until noon," he said without looking at them. "After that, I'll expect this place empty." Neither woman argued. That bothered him. Thomas walked the land hard after that, fence to fence, field to field. He needed the movement, the physical certainty of boundaries. The women's presence had disturbed something deeper than ownership. At the far edge of the property, he found something else. A small fire pit, cold now, ash scattered by wind. It wasn't old. He knelt, touched the ground, still faintly warm beneath the surface. They hadn't just arrived last night. When he stood, he noticed footprints leading back toward the barn, but also others, heading in the opposite direction, toward the trees beyond his land. More than two. Thomas returned to the house with a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with age. At noon, the barn door was still open. The women were still there. They stood this time, waiting. Their things were packed, minimal, efficient. Ruth spoke first. "We'll go," Ellen added. "We just needed one more night." Thomas looked past them into the shadows of the barn. One more night for what? They exchanged a glance. Not fear, not guilt, decision. Ruth answered softly. "To see if anyone would come looking." The words landed heavier than Thomas expected. "Looking for you?" he asked. Ellen shook her head. "Looking through here." The land outside felt suddenly larger, too open. "Who?" Thomas said. Ruth met his gaze. "The kind of people who don't knock." Silence followed, long and uncomfortable. Thomas thought of the footprints, the fire pit, the way the women slept like they expected morning to come quietly. "You can stay tonight," he said finally. Both women stiffened. "After that," he continued, "we talk." Ruth studied him carefully. "Why?" Thomas didn't answer right away. Because he had spent his life believing land was something you controlled, and suddenly he wasn't sure this land belonged to him at all. Thomas didn't sleep much that night. He lay on the old mattress in the farmhouse, eyes open in the dark, listening to the land like it was a room full of strangers. Every shift of wind sounded like a footstep. Every creak of wood felt like a warning. At 2 a.m, he got up and sat at the kitchen table again. The habit irritated him. He hadn't been this alert in years. Not since the last months before retirement, when he'd started waking to nothing and still felt watched. At first light, he made coffee, poured 3 cups, and carried them toward the barn. He didn't call out. He didn't announce himself. He pushed the door open. The women were awake, sitting close together, backs against the wall, blankets folded neatly beside them. Ruth's eyes tracked him immediately. Ellen's gaze stayed lower, as if she didn't want to look too directly at a man who had offered them a second night. Thomas set the cups on an overturned crate, then stepped back. "We talk," he said. Ruth nodded once. "We will." Ellen picked up a cup, cradling it like it mattered. Thomas waited. He'd learned that if you let people fill silence, they often told the truth by accident. Ruth was the one who broke first. "Someone will come," she said. Thomas kept his face still. "Who?" Ruth's mouth tightened. "Men." "That's not an answer." "It is where we come from," she replied. Ellen took a small sip, then spoke softly. "We were on a farm not far from here, about 7 miles, maybe 8. Thomas's eyes narrowed. "Working?" Ellen's shoulders lifted in a tight shrug. "Trying. It wasn't our farm." Ruth's voice sharpened. "It was our father's once." Thomas felt something shift in his chest. The word once carried weight. Ellen continued, careful. "When he died, things didn't go clean. People came around. Papers appeared. Friends who weren't friends. The county didn't fight hard." Thomas didn't interrupt. He had seen that story 100 times, in 100 different towns. "What does that have to do with me?" he asked. Ruth's gaze held his. "Because when you bought this land, you bought someone's mistake." Thomas stared at her. He didn't like the way that sounded. Like the land had a memory, and he'd stepped into it without knowing. Ellen looked up now. "We didn't come here to steal," she said quickly. "We came because we needed a place no one would check." Thomas's jaw tightened. "From who?" Ruth hesitated. That was new. Until now, she'd been too certain. "From Cal Mercer," she said finally. Thomas didn't recognize the name, but he recognized the type the name belonged to. Short, hard syllables. The kind that didn't apologize. "Who is he?" Thomas asked. Ellen answered, He runs repairs, equipment, fences, security, whatever folks pay him for. Ruth's voice was flat as stone. He also collects. Thomas nodded once. He understood. There were men like Mercer everywhere, men who smelled weakness in the air and called it opportunity. And he's looking for you, Thomas said. Ruth shook her head slightly. He's looking for what we took. Thomas felt his stomach tighten. What did you take? Ellen's hand started to tremble around the cup. She set it down before she spilled it. Ruth looked away, and in that small movement Thomas caught something else. Shame mixed with resolve. A dangerous combination. We didn't steal money, Ruth said. Not the way you think. Ellen swallowed. We took records. Thomas frowned. Records of what? Ellen breathed in slowly, then spoke. The kind of records that make a man like Cal Mercer disappear if the right people see them. Thomas didn't move. He had spent most of his life dealing in information. In the army, a folder could be more dangerous than a weapon. In retirement, he'd almost forgotten that. What kind of records? He asked again. Ruth's eyes returned to him, and now there was a hard edge in them. Proof, names, deals, the kind of paper that doesn't belong in a barn office. Thomas stared at them for a long moment. You're telling me you have evidence, he said, and you ran to my property to hide. Ellen's voice broke slightly. We ran because we thought he'd kill us. The bluntness of it made the barn feel smaller. Thomas didn't react, not outwardly. But inside he felt an old familiar coldness settle into place, an emotion he had spent years trying to bury. Danger had a smell. You never forgot it. He looked at the barn door. Why here? He asked. Ruth answered without hesitation. Because you're new. Because you're alone. Because no one expects anything from this land. And because men like him don't like soldiers. Thomas almost laughed at that, but it wasn't funny. They don't like anyone who might push back, Ruth clarified. Thomas's voice stayed even. Where are the records now? Ellen glanced toward a corner of the barn, where a loose plank sat slightly uneven. Thomas noted it immediately. He walked over and knelt, tugging the plank up with careful force. Underneath, wrapped in oilcloth and plastic, was a thin bundle. Papers, a small notebook, a flash drive. Thomas stared at it like it was a live animal. Ellen whispered, We didn't know what else to do. Thomas stood and held the bundle in his hands. A flash drive. That was modern enough to change the entire shape of this story. Paper could be argued. A drive could be copied, sent, multiplied. You went to the police? He asked. Ruth's laugh was short and bitter. In a county where Cal Mercer eats breakfast with the sheriff twice a week? Thomas absorbed that without comment. He walked back, set the bundle on the crate beside the coffee cups, and looked at the two women. You understand what you've done, he said quietly. You dropped this on a stranger. Ruth met his gaze. You dropped your money on a farm you didn't understand. That stung because it was true. Thomas's fingers rested on the edge of the crate. Outside, a truck engine sounded in the distance, faint but real. Ruth's head snapped slightly toward the sound. Ellen's face went pale. Thomas didn't move. The engine grew louder, slow and deliberate, like someone who knew exactly where they were going. Ruth spoke in a low voice. That's him. Thomas stared out through the barn slats, watching the fields. In his mind, he saw two paths. 1. Call someone. Step back, let the system handle it. 2. Do what he'd done his whole life. Stand between danger and the people it was coming for. He exhaled slowly. Close the door, he said to Ruth. Quietly. Ruth moved. Thomas picked up the bundle again, and for the first time since he'd bought the land, he realized something with absolute clarity. This property was no longer quiet farmland. It was a test. The truck stopped short of the house. Thomas could hear the engine idle, not rushed, not tentative. Whoever sat behind the wheel wasn't lost. He was patient. The kind of patience that came from knowing time favored him. Thomas stepped out of the barn into full daylight. He did not hurry. He walked as if the land still belonged to him, as if no one else had the right to set the pace. The truck door opened. Cal Mercer climbed out slowly, boots hitting the ground with deliberate weight. Mid-50s, thick through the shoulders. A man who had never needed to be fast because he was rarely alone. 2 more doors opened. Younger men. Leaner. Quiet. They stayed close to the truck, eyes moving, taking in fence lines and distances. Thomas stopped 10 yards away. "Morning," Mercer called. His voice carried easily. "Didn't mean to intrude." Thomas said nothing. Mercer smiled like a man who mistook silence for weakness. He took a few steps closer, stopping at a respectful distance. He had learned, somewhere along the way, how not to cross invisible lines too quickly. "I'm looking for 2 women," Mercer continued. "They were supposed to leave town yesterday. Didn't." Thomas held Mercer's gaze. "You're standing on private land." Mercer nodded. "I know. Congratulations on the purchase. Folks said it wouldn't last long." "That a warning?" Thomas asked. Mercer shrugged. "Just an observation." He glanced past Thomas toward the barn. One of the younger men followed his eyes. Thomas shifted slightly, just enough to block the view. Mercer noticed. "Funny thing," Mercer said. "When something goes missing around here, it usually turns up somewhere quiet. Somewhere a man thinks no one's watching." Thomas felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the old readiness not for violence but for decision. "I don't know what you think is missing," Thomas said. "But I don't answer questions from men who show up uninvited." Mercer's smile thinned. "I don't think you understand the situation." Thomas nodded once. "That's usually how men like you start conversations." The air went still. Mercer's eyes hardened, but he kept his tone even. "Those women took something that doesn't belong to them," Thomas replied calmly. "Neither does intimidation." One of the younger men shifted his weight. Mercer raised a hand slightly. The man stopped. "You military?" Mercer asked. "Retired," Thomas answered. Mercer studied him again, more carefully this time. He saw it now, the posture, the restraint, the way Thomas didn't move unless he meant to. "That explains the confidence," Mercer said. "No," Thomas replied. "It explains the patience." Mercer chuckled. "I don't want trouble." Thomas looked at the truck, the men, the way Mercer had positioned himself between them. "You brought it with you," Thomas said. Mercer sighed, like a man disappointed by someone else's stubbornness. "All I want is what's mine. After that, I leave." Thomas shook his head slowly. "You leave either way." For a brief moment, Mercer looked genuinely surprised. Then his expression hardened. "You don't know who you're protecting," he said. "Those women don't belong anywhere. They cause problems. You let them stay, you inherit that." Thomas felt a flash of anger. Not loud, not explosive. The kind that came from hearing something profoundly dishonest, spoken with confidence. "You mistake me," Thomas said quietly. "I don't protect people because they're harmless. I protect them because someone decided they weren't worth protecting." Mercer's jaw clenched. He looked past Thomas again, toward the barn. "You've got one chance," Mercer said. "Step aside. Let me handle it. You walk away clean." Thomas didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Mercer's eyes locked onto it instantly. "That," Mercer said slowly, "doesn't belong to you." Thomas held it up just long enough for Mercer to recognize what it was, and long enough for him to realize Thomas understood its value. "You're wrong," Thomas said. "It belongs to anyone who needs to see it." The younger men stiffened. Mercer's voice dropped. "You don't know what you're holding." "I know exactly what I'm holding," Thomas replied. "And I know what happens if it disappears." Mercer stared at him, calculating. He could take it by force, but not without witnesses, not without consequences he couldn't control. "Where are the women?" Mercer asked. Thomas met his eyes. "Safe." Mercer exhaled sharply. "You think this ends if I leave?" Thomas nodded once. "It ends when you do." The two men by the truck shifted again, uneasy now. This wasn't the easy recovery Mercer had promised them. Mercer looked around, the open fields, the fences, the quiet that suddenly felt like scrutiny. "You're making a mistake," he said. Thomas's voice was steady. "I've made enough to recognize one." Mercer studied him for a long moment, then turned toward the truck. "This isn't over," he said over his shoulder. Thomas didn't reply. The truck started. Gravel shifted under tires. The engine faded slowly as it moved back down the road. Only when it disappeared beyond the tree line did Thomas allow himself to breathe out fully. He turned toward the barn. The door opened. Ruth stood there, pale but composed. Ellen behind her, hands clasped tightly. "He'll be back," Ellen said. Thomas nodded. "Yes." Ruth's voice was quiet. "Why did you do that?" Thomas looked across the land, his land, and felt the weight of the question settle. "Because I've spent my life walking away when it was easier," he said. "And I'm tired of easy." The barn door closed behind them, and for the first time since dawn, the land felt like it was holding its breath. Cal Mercer didn't come back that night. That worried Thomas more than if he had. Silence, after a threat, was rarely peace. It was recalculation. Thomas locked the house not because he expected a break-in, but because routine mattered. He made dinner, simple, steady movements, and ate alone at the table, listening to the wind slide across the fields. When darkness settled, he walked the perimeter once more, lantern in hand, stopping at each fence post as if taking inventory of something older than ownership. At the barn, he paused. Ruth and Ellen were inside, awake, sitting, waiting. "They'll try another angle," Ruth said before he spoke. Thomas nodded. "They always do." Ellen watched him carefully. "You could still walk away." "I already didn't," he replied. That night, Thomas slept in short stretches. Not fear, purpose. He was assembling something in his mind, the way he used to before difficult operations. Sequence, timing, consequence. At dawn, he brewed coffee and laid the bundle on the table. Papers first. He read slowly, marking names, dates, small inconsistencies that revealed large lies. He slid the flash drive into his old laptop and waited. Files opened, ledgers, photographs, audio recordings, enough to ruin more than one man. Enough to explain why Mercer wanted the problem erased, not solved. By mid-morning, Thomas made a decision. He didn't call the local sheriff. He drove. The county seat was 40 minutes away. Long enough to think, long enough to remember why he'd left places before, because staying meant choosing. He parked across from the federal building, the kind that didn't advertise its seriousness. Inside, the air was cool and clean. A man at the desk asked how he could help. Thomas placed the bundle down gently. "I have information," he said, "and I want a receipt." They took him seriously. Not because he raised his voice, but because he didn't. Hours passed, questions, verification, phone calls that left the room and didn't return quickly. At one point, a woman with careful eyes asked Thomas why he was doing this. He considered the answer. "Because I don't like men who confuse leverage with authority," he said. When he left, the sun was already lowering. He drove back through fields that looked the same as they had yesterday. That was the trick of places like this. They wore continuity like armor. 2 miles from his gate, he saw the truck, parked, engine off, empty. Thomas stopped the vehicle, scanned the road, then continued. At the farmhouse, Ruth and Ellen waited on the porch. "He came," Ruth said. "Left," Ellen added. Thomas nodded. He won't be back. Ruth studied him. You're sure? I didn't say today, Thomas replied. I said not like before. They stood there a moment, three people bound by a decision that had already been made. What happens now? Ellen asked. Thomas looked at the land. Quiet again, but changed. Quiet now carried memory. You leave, he said. Soon. Before curiosity finds you. Ruth bristled. You're sending us away? I'm sending you forward, Thomas said. There's a difference. He handed them an envelope. Inside were copies, addresses, a name they could trust. Ellen swallowed. You don't even know us. Thomas met her eyes. I know enough. They left before sunset. No ceremony, no promises. Just the sound of a car moving down the same road Mercer had used, this time without threat clinging to the dust. That night, Thomas sat on the porch as the sky dimmed. He thought about the years he'd spent believing that land was a reward for service, that quiet was an entitlement. He had been wrong. Quiet was a responsibility. Weeks passed. The fields grew. The barn stayed closed. One hinge still newer than the others. Thomas fixed it anyway. News arrived in pieces, a name mentioned on the radio, an investigation ongoing, a man who stopped answering calls. Thomas listened without satisfaction. One morning, a letter came, no return address. Inside, a single sentence. We made it. Thank you for standing. Thomas folded it carefully and placed it in the coffee tin. The land remained quiet. But now, when the wind moved through the grass, it sounded less like emptiness and more like agreement. Thomas rose, stepped into the light, and went back to work.